The fluorescent lights hummed their steady frequency as Brooke Sullivan's hands moved across the forecart, each motion practiced and precise. Her hands. The same hands that had held a tourniquet on a femoral artery for 40 minutes while mortars fell in Marjah. The same hands that now trembled when she reached for a 20-gauge catheter in the pre-dawn darkness of Oak Creek Memorial's Trauma Bay in Savannah. Not trembled. Controlled. There was a difference. Trembling was fear. This was something else, muscle memory asserting itself against conscious will, like her body remembered what her mind was trying to forget. She'd learned in the corpsman's training that pain was information. That blood loss could be calculated. That shock followed predictable stages. But nobody had a protocol for how to treat the thing that happened to you after you'd treated everyone else's wounds. The trauma bay smelled like antiseptic, and something underneath it, the copper tang of blood that never quite washed away, no matter how many times housekeeping ran the mop. She moved through the controlled chaos like she was moving through sandstorms again, jaw locked, eyes forward, absorbing the noise and motion without letting any of it penetrate. The pneumatic tube system fired, that sudden whoosh and hiss of pressurized air launching lab samples to the 3rd floor. Her hands froze mid-chart. 2 seconds. 1 breath. Then she resumed writing, her penmanship as steady as a surgical laser. She'd learned that particular trick in Kandahar. The art of returning to normal before anyone noticed you'd left it. Bed 7 held a Marine commander, 43 years old, compound fracture of the left tibia, post-surgical sedation from the orthopedic team upstairs. The morphine pump clicked its soft rhythm, a metronome counting down his pain into manageable increments. Brooke approached from the left, her badge reading B. Sullivan, RN, in white letters on a laminated rectangle that had gotten worn grey at the edges from 3 years of being clipped to scrub pockets. She reached for his wrist to check the radial pulse, and that's when she saw it. His forearm. Tattooed across the inside in block letters that looked like they'd been done in a field clinic or a borrowed tattoo gun, Sullivan. Her name. Not her rank. Not her call sign, Malakal Mort, the angel of death, the thing they'd whispered in Pashto when her profile came up in intelligence briefings. Just her name. Sullivan. Like a prayer the commander had written into his own skin. She knew what it meant. She'd pulled 3 Marines out of a burning Humvee at Sanjin Valley. She'd kept the squad leader breathing while they waited for dust off. She'd written her name on his arm with a ballpoint pen because he was delirious and kept asking her not to let him forget. But that had been 7 years ago. That had been a different lifetime. That had been someone else. The commander's eyes opened, morphine-hazed and distant, moving across her face without catching on anything. His pupils were dilated, his gaze soft as water. He looked through her the way patients looked through nurses every day, seeing a uniform and a function but not a person. She was the fall line. She was the medication cart. She was the voice that said the doctor would be in shortly. His eyes slid past her face and back toward the ceiling, and she felt something in her chest constrict like a fist. Brooke allowed herself one slow breath. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Military discipline. Compartmentalization. The same technique that had kept her alive when her platoon was taking fire from 3 directions and the corpsman next to her had stopped moving. She reached for his radial pulse, 72 beats per minute, strong and steady, a heartbeat that remembered nothing of what those hands had done to save it. 1 tear escaped the corner of her left eye. She felt it slide down her cheek like a small betrayal. She wiped it away without breaking stride, her movement smooth and unremarkable, the kind of gesture 1,000 nurses made during a shift when the fluorescent lights gave them headaches or when a difficult family member said something cruel. Nobody was watching. Nobody would remember. And even if they did, they would see only what they expected to see, a tired nurse at the end of her shift, going through the motions. The commander's chart was completed in her precise handwriting, vital stable, medication administration logged, fluid intake documented. Every note meticulous. Every entry verified. Brooke had learned that level of documentation rigor in the Navy, where a single error in a medical record could mean the difference between a successful medical board review and a dishonorable discharge. Old habits. The kind that followed you even when you were trying very hard to become someone anonymous. She was reviewing the supply orders for the trauma bay when Dr. Hargrove entered, his presence arriving before his physical body did, the air pressure changing the way it changed when a storm system rolled into Savannah off the Atlantic. He was a tall man, the kind of tall that made him duck slightly in doorways, and he wore his authority like the tailored fabric of his white coat, crisp and expensive and carefully maintained. His eyes moved across the trauma bay in a way that suggested he was cataloging things, calculating things, seeing problems and solutions in rapid succession. That was the thing about Dr. Hargrove, he was smart in a way that made competence look easy. Dangerous competence. The kind that built empires and crushed people quietly. He was looking directly at her. More specifically, he was looking directly at the clipboard in her hands. The itemized supply orders for Oak Creek Memorial's trauma department ran to 4 pages, detailed accounting of which equipment had been used, when it had been logged out, where it had gone. Brooke had been cross-referencing the supply log with the actual equipment in bed 6 and 7, a task that hadn't been explicitly assigned to her but which she'd begun doing quietly over the past 6 weeks. The numbers didn't match. Or rather, they matched in some places and didn't match in others, and the discrepancies followed a pattern that suggested either remarkable carelessness or remarkable intentionality. She hadn't intended to find anything. She'd just wanted to understand where the expensive equipment had gone, because her father had been uninsured when his stroke happened, and she remembered the hospital billing his estate for items that never showed up in his actual care. She remembered her mother working 2 jobs to pay for a morphine pump they'd never installed. And when you'd seen that happen to your own family, you couldn't help but notice when the numbers started moving in ways that didn't make medical sense. Dr. Hargrove crossed the trauma bay in 6 strides. His hands were large, well-maintained, the kind of hands that performed surgeries and signed documents that changed people's lives. He didn't ask. He simply reached out and took the clipboard from her hands, not aggressively, but with the complete absence of hesitation that came from knowing nobody would stop him. "I'll take those," he said. His voice was smooth as warm oil. "Clerical work belongs in the office, not the bedside." Brooke released the clipboard. Her hands fell to her sides. "The supply discrepancies," she said quietly. "They don't match the billing is handled by administration." His eyes flicked across the itemized orders, and for just a moment, 1/10 of a second, something shifted in his expression. Not fear. Not quite. But recognition. The way a predator recognizes another predator. "You're a nurse. Stick to nursing." He turned and walked away, the clipboard tucked under his arm like he was carrying something valuable. Like he'd stolen something valuable. Brooke stood motionless, her hands hanging empty at her sides. Around her, the trauma bay continued its organized chaos. Monitors beeped. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. The 4 pumps clicked their measured doses of medication into patients who would never know the cost of what they were receiving. The break room smelled like old coffee and the particular despair that accumulated in hospital staff rooms at 2:56 a.m. Brooke sat at the corner table with a cold sandwich from the vending machine, unwrapping it with the kind of attention people usually reserved for things that mattered. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the fluorescent lights overhead, which hummed their steady frequency like they were keeping time for everyone's exhaustion. 3 nurses entered at once, Terry from the surgical unit, Jackie who worked the night shift in ICU, and someone from the pediatric floor whose name Brooke had learned 6 months ago but whose presence had become progressively less comfortable. They were laughing about something, their voices carrying the easy rhythm of people who'd worked together long enough to complete each other's jokes. They saw Brooke at the table. They saw the empty chair beside her. Terry's hand came up and found Jackie's elbow. Jackie's eyes flicked toward Brooke and away. The pediatric nurse said something too quiet to hear, and all 3 of them moved toward the opposite table, 3 chairs pulled away from the worn laminate surface with a sound like an orchestrated rebuke. The scraping of furniture. The synchronized departure. The deliberate choreography of people who decided that your presence was something to be avoided. They were laughing again before they'd sat down, their volume increasing slightly, as if laughter could fill the space they'd created between themselves and her. Brooke took a bite of the sandwich. Turkey and mustard on wheat bread. Flavorless. She chewed it anyway because eating was a function and functions continued whether you felt anything or not. That was something else they'd taught her in corpsman training. The body kept going even when the mind wanted to stop. The body kept functioning even when the heart wanted to shut down. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Brooke Sullivan had maintained composure in a forward operating base where 217 Marines were under fire from 3 directions simultaneously. She'd kept her hand steady while extracting shrapnel from a fellow corpsman's abdomen by flashlight, because the medevac helicopter was still 20 minutes out and the tourniquet was only buying time. She'd watched people try to break her, and she'd watched them fail, and she'd learned that there was a kind of strength that looked like silence. So she sat at her table in Oak Creek Memorial's break room and let them leave. She ate her sandwich. She didn't flinch. She didn't flush red. She didn't leave the room in retreat. She simply continued existing in the space they decided to abandon, her presence the quiet thing that refused to be erased even when everyone tried very hard to pretend she wasn't there. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when she returned to the trauma bay and found the formal write-up taped to the unit board, a red marker notation that seemed to glow against the white plastic surface of the scheduling board where everyone could see it. Insubordination, final warning. Her name underlined twice. And underneath, in smaller letters that somehow felt even more damning, unauthorized access to administrative documents. Failure to remain within scope of practice. She stood in front of the board for 3 seconds. That was all the time she allowed herself. Then she turned away, her jaw locked tight, and returned to bed 7 where the commander was sleeping, his morphine pump clicking its measured rhythm, his tattoo of her name moving slightly with each breath he took. She checked his vitals. She logged his medication. She moved through the remaining hours of her shift with the kind of invisible competence that nobody would ever praise and nobody would ever remember. The trauma bay doors hissed open at 08 for 7, and Dr. Hargrove stood waiting like a prosecutor who'd already decided the verdict. Brooke was checking the commander's full line when he arrived, catheter patent, normal saline running at a steady drip, everything documented in the chart with the precision that had made her dangerous. The commander's adult daughter sat in the corner chair, eyes red-rimmed, still in yesterday's clothes, watching the machines as if her stare could keep her father alive. Hargrove didn't knock. He pulled the chart from the foot of the bed and opened it with theatrical slowness, running his finger down Brooke's notes like a man searching for contraband. The fluorescent lights cast his face in shades of institutional white, and his voice, when it came, carried the false concern of someone performing competence for an audience. Nurse Sullivan. Not a greeting. A summons. Your charting procedures are dangerously inadequate. The daughter's head snapped up. Brooke kept her eyes on the foresight, checking the insertion angle, the tape placement, the angle of the tubing. Steady work. Necessary work. This patient's family deserves documentation that reflects actual clinical standards. Hargrove's voice climbed slightly, aware of the daughter watching, aware of 2 orderlies pausing in the hallway. Not these, creative interpretations of what you believe constitutes proper notation. He held up the chart. Brooke's handwriting was clear, chronological, precise. Every medication logged with timestamp. Every vital sign trend noted. Every clinical observation backed by objective data. The kind of documentation that left no room for phantom charges, no space for billing equipment that was never used, no gap where ghost patients could hide in the system's machinery. She said nothing. Not because she was uncertain, but because certainty didn't need volume. Your approach to charting, this obsessive detail, this questioning of standard supply protocols, creates liability for the entire department. His eyes flicked to her face, searching for a flinch, a sign of fracture. I've been in medicine for 32 years. I know what competent nursing looks like. This isn't it. The daughter leaned forward. Doctor, I'm sure whatever. I'm addressing your father's clinical team. Hargrove didn't even glance at her. Nurse Sullivan, we need to discuss your employment status. Brooke finished her assessment of the foresight. The catheter was secure. The flow was appropriate. She turned to face him, and her jaw moved through a single, deliberate breath. When she spoke, her voice landed flat and level, like a metronome calibrated to exactly the right pressure. I've been written up for worse things, Doctor. The room seemed to compress. The daughter's breath caught. One of the orderlies in the hallway actually stepped back. Hargrove's face flushed, but before he could respond, Brooke was already moving, not retreating, not defending, simply pivoting toward the medication cart with a kind of efficiency that announced she had other patients to see, other work that mattered more than his manufactured offense. She didn't wait for dismissal. She didn't apologize. She didn't even look back. The commander watched her go, his medicated eyes tracking the sound of her shoes on tile as Hargrove stood holding the chart like a weapon that had somehow failed to detonate. The break room at 12:15 was a careful geography of absence. Brooke set her lunch bag on the table, tuna sandwich, apple, water bottle, and pulled out the chair. 3 nurses were gathered near the microwave, their conversation stopping the moment she sat down. Not gradually stopping, not fading away, but cutting off like someone had used shears. Their chairs made a sound like orchestrated percussion as they scraped backward. One nurse, Jennifer, who'd borrowed Brooke's stethoscope last month, gathered her yogurt container with exaggerated care. Don't want to catch whatever insubordination bug she's got, she said, her voice carefully pitched to carry across the room without acknowledging direct address. Heard it spreads through staff meetings. The other 2 produced performative laughter, the kind that sounded rehearsed. They left in formation, their departure deliberate, establishing distance like dogs defining territory. The microwave beeped from across the room. Nobody claimed the food inside. The smell of reheated coffee, bitter, stale, the kind of antiseptic bitterness that belonged to this place, hung in the empty space. Brooke ate alone under lights that buzzed with the frequency of something dying slowly. She didn't check her phone. Didn't look at the doorway. Didn't acknowledge the silence that had become her new geography at Oak Creek Memorial. She simply worked through the sandwich, methodical and complete, like a procedure that had been calculated and refined. At 13:20, she taped the break room's trash receptacle closed and moved toward the unit board. It was impossible to miss. Red marker, block letters, the kind of presentation that demanded attention. The paper had been laminated once, then written over with permanent ink, creating a memorial quality to what was essentially a document of failure. Insubordination, final warning, B. Sullivan. Every staff member walked past it. Some lingered. One nurse actually pointed, explaining something to a pharmacy tech. The charge nurse had added a yellow sticky note in the corner, counseling session mandatory 1400, contact HR before shift end. Brooke noted the timestamp. 1400 was 40 minutes away. She calculated what that meant in the context of her remaining patients, what medication schedules needed adjustment before she left the unit, what handoff information the evening shift would require. The practical always came first. The emotional was accommodated in margins. The physician station was visible from the hallway, and Dr. Hargrove sat at the central desk with his phone already raised to his ear. His voice was too low to hear, but Brooke recognized the posture, spine straight, jaw tight, the bearing of someone making institutional calls. The kind that moved through telephone lines and created consequences that propagated through systems nobody could see until they arrived as personnel files flagged for review, as credentialing offices requesting documentation, as outside investigators being activated to examine work. His phone went down, then up again immediately. First call completed. Second call initiated. He turned slightly away from the unit, creating the illusion of privacy, though anyone watching could read the frustration in his shoulders, the tension of a man discovering that his authority, while significant, was not absolute. Brooke moved past with the invisible efficiency of hospital staff doing their job. She didn't pause. Didn't acknowledge the performance. Her hands were steady as she accessed the medication room, drew up the afternoon doses, checked names against patient identification bands. The work was mechanical and essential. The work was all she'd allow herself to do. In the commander's room at 13:45, she found him dozing, his breathing steady and deep. His tattoo was visible, her name in block letters on his forearm, black ink, permanent reminder of a person and a moment and a choice made under fire. His medicated eyes didn't recognize her? The MRI results clipped to his chart showed no new lesions, no surgical need, the trajectory of his recovery established and moving forward. She checked his She noted his vitals. She documented her observations in the chart with the same precision that had made Hargrove so profoundly uncomfortable, every detail logged, every assessment backed by objective data, every entry a quiet assertion that she had been here, she had done this work, and the record would reflect it exactly as it had occurred. The fluorescent lights buzzed their perpetual electronic song above her head. Somewhere in the building, a code was being called. Somewhere a family was receiving bad news. Somewhere Dr. Hargrove was making phone calls to people who understood what it meant when a nurse's documentation threatened to expose a carefully constructed system of billing fiction. Brooke returned the chart to the foot of the bed and moved toward the door. The commander stirred slightly but didn't wake. She had 45 minutes before before the formal counseling session that was really a presentation of predetermined conclusions, before whatever architecture of liability Hargrove was constructing became visible in writing. She needed to finish her rounds. She needed to ensure every patient had everything required for continuity of care. The world might be contracting around her, but the work remained absolute. The work was the one thing they couldn't take, not really, not as long as her hands remained steady and her mind remained clear on what mattered. The unit board would wait. The red marker warning would still be there tomorrow. But right now there were patients who needed her competence, her precision, her quiet dignity applied to the work of keeping people alive. She moved through the unit with the bearing of someone who had survived far worse than institutional humiliation, and the fluorescent lights hummed their electric song above her as she worked. At 0300 hours, the fluorescent lights of Oak Creek Memorial 7th floor unit cast their unforgiving glow across the commander's face. Brooke had finished her rounds 30 minutes earlier, vital stable, O2 sat 94% on supplemental oxygen, heart rate holding steady in the low 80s. She was at the nurse's station reviewing medication reconciliation when the sound came, sharp, sudden, a monitor alarm that cut through the hospital's late-night hum like a knife. She didn't run. Senior chief petty officers don't run. They move with purpose, with the kind of deliberate speed that comes from having made life-and-death decisions in places where hesitation meant body bags. The commander's chest told her everything in 3 seconds. Asymmetrical. The left side wasn't rising like the right. His oxygen saturation already dropping, 92, 89, 85, and his eyes were wide with the particular panic of a man whose lungs suddenly couldn't find air. His trachea had shifted. She could see it now, the subtle deviation to the right, the compressed neck veins like cords standing out beneath his skin. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against his heart, suffocating him from the inside out. The code team was 3 minutes away minimum. The commander didn't have 3 minutes. Brooke's hands moved on their own. Muscle memory has its own logic, its own language, a dialect learned in the darkness of field hospitals where the only light came from headlamps and the only choices were act or watch someone die. She was already moving toward the crash cart, grabbing a 14-gauge angiocatheter, her movements economical and exact. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Her fingers found the needle insertion point, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and she cleansed the skin with one fluid motion, her touch gentle but certain. The needle went in. There was a moment of resistance, then the sudden hiss of air escaping, that unmistakable sound of pressure releasing, of a lung re-inflating as the pneumothorax decompressed. Just like that. 3 seconds. The sound of a man getting his next breath. His oxygen saturation climbed immediately. 90, 94, 98. The monitor's frantic beeping slowed to a steady rhythm, no longer the scream of crisis, just the normal conversation of a healing body. The commander's breathing steadied. His eyes, which had been locked on hers in that particular way of someone drowning, softened back into something like consciousness. "You," he whispered, his voice rough with morphine and confusion. "You were." But he trailed off, the medication pulling him back down into its fog. Brooke placed a gloved hand against his shoulder, steady and firm. "Rest, Commander. Your lung collapsed. It's stable now." She didn't say, "I did that." Heroes don't announce themselves. They simply ensure the next person gets to take another breath. The code team arrived 47 seconds later, already moving toward the room at full sprint, but Dr. Hargrove was there first. He'd been in the building, always in the building, his presence like an infection that won't clear. He took in the scene in one sweep, Brooke at the bedside with the angiocatheter still in place, the chest X-ray already being cooled down, the commander's vital signs stable and climbing toward normal. Hargrove's face went through a series of micro-expressions so fast they were barely visible, surprise, then calculation, then something darker. Something that looked like a man watching his script get rewritten by an actor he hadn't authorized. He didn't say anything. Not then. He just stood there for a moment, taking in every detail, his eyes traveling from the commander to the monitor to Brooke's face with the intensity of a predator assessing prey. Then he turned and left the room without a word. The code team backed out, their services no longer needed. The charge nurse who arrived moments after looked at Brooke with something that might have been admiration, except admiration wasn't permitted in this hospital anymore. That was. The charge nurse started, then stopped. She'd seen Hargrove's expression. Everyone had. Good nursing, she finished carefully. Not great nursing. Not exceptional nursing. Good nursing. A deliberately diminished word, a careful retreat into acceptable language. Brooke didn't respond. She simply began documenting the event with a kind of meticulous detail that would make a prosecutor weep, time of discovery, vital signs at 15-second intervals, exact location of needle insertion, the precise sound and feel of the decompression, everything. Every word would be true. Every number would be exact. And every line would become evidence. By 05:30, when the sun hadn't yet thought about rising over Savannah, Brooke was finishing her shift. The commander was sleeping naturally now, no longer on continuous monitoring, his chest rising and falling with the kind of steady rhythm that meant he was going to be fine. His daughter had called at 0430, some kind of early morning premonition, and Brooke had given her the update, collapsed lung. Decompressed successfully. Recovery should be uncomplicated. The daughter had wept, grateful tears, the kind that come when someone tells you your parent is going to live. Those tears would be important later. Brooke didn't know that yet. She only knew they would sustain her through the next 12 hours. Hargrove had made his phone calls by then. She wouldn't know about them until later, but the mechanics of institutional violence don't wait for convenient timing. At 0527, he was sitting in his office with the door closed, his fingers moving across his phone screen with the deliberate precision of a chess master making moves 3 positions ahead. The first call went to James Richardson, the hospital board chair, a man who owned a vacation home in the Keys and took it every December, always finding himself with some problem that needed solving, some situation that required discretion and a willingness to let certain events disappear from the official record. Hargrove had been very helpful with those situations. Very helpful indeed. "James, we have a credentialing issue that needs attention." Hargrove's voice would be smooth as oil on water. "One of the nurses. I need her background verification flagged for deeper review. Mental health history, possibly. Substance abuse concerns. Standard precaution." The board chair would owe him more than he already did. The second call went to the hospital's credentialing office, a woman named Patricia Chen who worked in a basement cubicle handling the endless paperwork of healthcare bureaucracy. She didn't have power in the traditional sense, but she had something almost better: she had authority. The ability to say we need more documentation or this doesn't quite match our requirements in a way that triggered endless administrative delays. "Patricia, I need Brooke Sullivan's nursing school transcripts re-verified. I'm seeing some inconsistencies in her stated credentials." This wasn't true. There were no inconsistencies. But the lie would require investigation, and investigation would require time, and time was what Hargrove was buying. Just between us, he'd add, I'm concerned about her stability. Some unusual patterns in her documentation style. Possibly trying to hide something. A lie wrapped in a suggestion. The most dangerous kind. The third call was the one that would matter most. Hargrove had retained an investigator, a former pharmaceutical sales rep named Marcus Devlin, who'd pivoted into background checking when pharma got too clean. Devlin had an interesting relationship with accuracy. He asked the right questions in the right way to get the answers he was being paid to find. Marcus, I need a background workup on a nurse. Deep dive. Former military possibly. I need to know if there are any psychiatric conditions, medication history, any reliability issues in her past. Discretion is important. Devlin would make calls to her references, and his questions would be shaped to guide answers toward concern. Would you say her mental health was consistently stable? / Did you ever notice signs of substance abuse? / Was there a pattern of erratic behavior? The kind of questions where no sounds defensive and yes sounds honest. By the time Brooke clocked out at 0700, the machinery was already turning. The chief medical officer, who kept his boat in the same marina as Hargrove, who had received several anonymous donations to his daughter's private school, who understood that institutional loyalty was a currency more valuable than money, had already received a memo flagging Brooke's file for review. 2 board members who played golf with Hargrove every Tuesday sent emails to the CEO expressing concerns about liability exposure and inconsistencies in care protocols. The investigator began making calls. The charge nurse received a direct instruction: Dr. Hargrove wants Sullivan off the commander in bed 7. Says her care is inconsistent. Not wrong. Not dangerous. Inconsistent. A word that cast suspicion without making an accusation. Brooke didn't know any of this yet. She was in the locker room, changing out of her scrubs, when her phone buzzed with a message from HR: please come to my office at 0800 tomorrow for credential verification meeting. Standard procedure. The fluorescent lights of the locker room buzzed their electric song above her head as she stared at those words. Standard procedure. She'd heard those words before, in military contexts, when something was about to be dismantled with bureaucratic precision. She pulled the faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining, the one she'd kept sewn there for 7 years, the one still stained with the commander's blood from Marjah, and she let her fingers trace the embroidery. Old muscle memory. A reminder. She had survived worse than this. She had survived far worse than anything a hospital administrator could orchestrate. The locker door clanged shut behind her. The sound echoed through the empty room, and for just a moment, Brooke Sullivan allowed herself to understand what was happening. Not the full scope of it, not yet. But enough. Hargrove had chosen his moment carefully. He'd let her save the commander so that her competence couldn't be questioned in isolation. But he'd also watched her do it, and he'd seen something in her that he recognized as dangerous: capability. Authority. The kind of quiet certainty that comes from having made life-and-death decisions when the alternative was everyone on your team dying. That kind of person was a threat to someone like Hargrove, who derived his power from position rather than competence, from politics rather than skill. She walked past the charge nurse's station, and there it was. The reassignment list. Her name crossed off the commander's room, replaced with someone new. Someone whose competence was unproven but whose loyalty was certain. That was how institutions protected themselves, not by rewarding excellence, but by punishing the people who made ordinary bureaucrats look small. Brooke didn't stop to protest. She simply noted the change, filed it away in the part of her mind that still operated on military logic, and kept walking toward the exit. Behind her, the hospital continued its endless work of healing and surviving and navigating the strange current of human ambition that had nothing to do with medicine. But right now there was something else moving through the hospital's corridors with the kind of quiet purpose that comes from having set wheels in motion that couldn't be stopped. Hargrove was already 3 moves ahead, or so he believed. He didn't understand yet that he'd just activated someone whose training had been forged in places where the stakes weren't career advancement or hospital politics. He didn't understand that by pushing Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan into a corner, he'd done something that no one at Oak Creek Memorial had done in the last 7 years. he'd given her permission to stop pretending to be someone she wasn't. By 0700 hours, the fluorescent lights of Oak Creek Memorial felt like the last place on earth Brooke Sullivan wanted to be. Security guard Marcus Chen stood outside HR with the cardboard box before either of them spoke. She'd stayed late 3 years ago when his mother came in diabetic and frightened, sat with the old woman while Marcus worked a double shift, held her hand while they adjusted her insulin. Now his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Brooke's shoulder, refusing the connection that had once meant something. Effective immediately, the HR director read from a laminated script, her voice the texture of corporate indifference. Pending investigation into your credentialing and employment history. Your badge is deactivated. You'll need to surrender your hospital ID and return all access cards. The box sat heavy in Brooke's hands. Inside, her locker contents. A pair of trauma shears engraved with a call sign she hadn't spoken in 7 years. 2 pairs of compression socks rolled into tight cylinders. A photograph of a fire team in Marjah, their faces burned dark by desert sun, their eyes carrying the kind of certainty that only comes from believing you're invincible. She didn't look at it. Hadn't looked at it since the morning she'd packed it away with the intention of burying that life forever. The jacket was there too. Navy blue, the kind you wear under your scrubs on winter mornings. Inside the lining, sewn with meticulous precision by someone in a fibre sewing kit, was a faded unit patch. Blood-stained. She'd kept it there for 7 years, a talisman no one knew existed. A promise made to a man with her name tattooed across his arm. You'll be contacted regarding the outcome of the investigation, the HR director continued. Security will escort you from the building. Please understand this is not a reflection on your clinical skills, but rather concerns that have been raised about your background and documentation practices. Hargrove's work. 3 phone calls and 48 hours had activated every institutional weapon in his arsenal. The board chair, the credentialing office, the retained investigator. Strategic. Competent. Ruthless. He understood power the way most people understood breathing, as something fundamental and natural. And he'd triggered every alarm because a woman in blue scrubs had done her job too well and threatened to expose 7 years of phantom equipment charges buried in supply chain invoices. Marcus walked her to the parking lot. His shoes clicked against the tile like a countdown. At the door, he finally met her eyes for one instant, an apology traveling across that space, a recognition that the world was unfolding in a way neither of them could stop. She nodded once. That was all there was to give. Her car was a 2006 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles on the odometer and a coffee stain on the passenger seat that had become permanent. She sat in the driver's seat with the cardboard box on her lap, hands gripping its edges like it might contain something that could still explode. The truth was simpler and darker than anyone knew. Brooke Sullivan had volunteered out of the Navy 5 years ago, not because she was weak, but because what she'd become in Marjah, what the Marines called Malakal Mort, the angel of death, the corpsman who could keep someone alive with nothing but her hands and her absolute refusal to accept loss, had nightmares with her name on them. She'd wake at 0300 smelling copper and smoke in a studio apartment in Savannah, her sheets soaked through, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't hold a coffee cup. Zoloft helped. Sleep medication helped. Therapy helped a little. But anonymity helped the most. A civilian nursing job where no one asked about scars, where a trembling hand during and for start could be explained as caffeine sensitivity, where she could be just Brooke the quiet nurse instead of Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan with a Navy Cross and 2 Bronze Stars with Valor hanging in a box under her bed. Her family thought she was still deployed, stationed somewhere she couldn't receive calls. Easier than the truth. Easier than watching them understand that the daughter they'd sent to serve her country had come back broken in ways that dress uniforms couldn't hide. She started the car. The engine turned over with the reluctant sound of something not quite ready to engage, which seemed like the perfect metaphor for everything. That afternoon, the VA hospital waiting room on Victory Drive was a museum of what sacrifice looked like. Veterans in faded unit caps sat in plastic chairs, their eyes carrying the particular distance of people who'd seen places where the world stopped being what they'd been told it was. A kid in a Marine Corps hoodie missing his right arm scrolled through his phone one-handed. An older man in a wheelchair with a prosthetic leg that caught the fluorescent light stared at nothing. A woman with a service dog at her feet clutched a folder to her chest the way Brooke clutched the cardboard box. The intake coordinator called her name. Brooke stood. The VA receptionist, a woman with kind eyes and a nameplate that said Patricia, handed her a form and pointed toward a room where a VA psychiatrist would evaluate her. That was the moment she understood she'd become the patient she used to save. The roles had inverted. She was no longer the one holding people together, she was the one being held. She filled out the form with the kind of precision that was her hallmark. Chief complaint: anxiety. Panic attacks with sleep disruption. Hypervigilance. Difficulty with civilian transitions. Medication: sertraline, 100 mg daily. Dosage history increased from 75 mg 3 months ago. Function: stable. Employment: recently terminated. The psychiatrist, a VA doctor named Chen, no relation, surely, looked at her file and asked the standard questions. How often are you having intrusive thoughts? Daily. How often are you sleeping through the night? Maybe twice a week. Have you ever had thoughts of harming yourself? Not since week 2 of the Zoloft. Do you have a support system? No. Family? Thinks I'm deployed. Friends? Don't have any. Colleagues? Just fired me. I'm going to recommend we get you into our PTSD track, Dr. Chen said, typing something into his computer. We have a group that meets Thursdays. Combat veterans, combat-related trauma, civilian reintegration issues. Might help to talk to people who understand what you're going through. Brooke nodded. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they hummed at Oak Creek Memorial, like they hummed everywhere in America. She wondered if Hargrove was celebrating somewhere. If the board chair had called to commend him for removing a problem employee. If anyone was asking questions about those phantom supply orders, or if they'd already been deleted, scrubbed from the system the way scandals got scrubbed when you had enough friends in enough places. But that wasn't the worst part. Not quite. 3 days later, the call came from Oak Creek Memorial staffing coordinator. Critical staffing shortages. Could Brooke return temporarily, just for the next 2 weeks, just for the overnight shifts while they brought agency nurses up to speed? They'd modify her role, no direct patient care, just documentation support and supply management. Nothing clinical. Nothing that would put anyone at risk. Brooke said yes. Not because she needed the money. Not because she wanted to see Oak Creek Memorial again. She said yes because not working felt like surrender, and Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan had been trained never to surrender. She returned on a Tuesday at 2,100 hours, her badge reprogrammed by IT with restricted access, her name flagged in the system with a red notation visible only to department heads. The nurse manager, a woman named Sarah who'd given her a hug on her first day 3 years ago, couldn't quite meet her eyes now. The charge nurse nodded a greeting that was more courtesy than warmth. She was a ghost working in the same building, paid by the hospital but trusted by no one. The first 2 nights were quiet. Documentation work. Inventory. The kind of invisible labor that kept hospitals functioning while the clinical staff moved across the unit like dancers in a choreographed routine. Brooke worked without speaking, without drawing attention, the way she'd been trained to work when the goal was to complete the mission without becoming part of the narrative. Then on Thursday at 18:47 hours, the ambulance alert came through. Trauma incoming. Gunshot wound to the abdomen, a 34-year-old male, vitals en route. The team mobilized. Doctors and nurses and respiratory therapy converged on Trauma Bay 2 with the kind of practiced urgency that came from doing this hundreds of times. Brooke was supposed to stay in the documentation room, but she moved toward the bay anyway, her body carrying her toward crisis the way it always did. The patient on the stretcher was thin, with dark hair and eyes that had seen things no one should see. A former Taliban fighter, the paramedic was saying. Emergency medical asylum, granted a month ago for working as a U.S. interpreter in Helmand Province. Translation services, high-level intelligence cooperation, now in protective status as a civilian. Gunshot wound, entry left abdomen, possible intestinal perforation, BP 88/56 and dropping. She leaned over to check his vitals because the nursing assistant hadn't arrived yet and the patient needed someone. His eyes focused on her face, and something shifted in them. Recognition. Fear. Something else. Malakal Mort, he whispered in Pashto, his voice barely audible beneath the chaos of the trauma activation. The Angel of Death. The name emerged from his throat like a prayer or a curse, she couldn't tell which. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator prepare its first breath. The interpreter's eyes locked onto hers the moment she approached his stretcher, and the entire trauma bay seemed to hold its breath. His hand trembled as it rose from the bed, and his voice came out in Pashto, a language she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years, the words tumbling over each other like prayers. Malakal Mort. The Angel of Death. You're alive. Brooke's hands moved with practiced precision, checking his assessing his vitals, her voice level and professional, easy. Breathing steady. But the room was already watching her differently now, the way the overhead light seemed to sharpen every detail of her face, and that's when the commander's daughter stepped forward from the doorway where she'd been waiting for her father's discharge paperwork. She was 23, maybe 24, with her father's eyes and her father's jaw, and she stared at Brooke like someone recognizing a ghost that had learned to walk in daylight. Senior Chief. The question hung in the fluorescent lit air like a suspended heartbeat. Brooke didn't pause in her documentation. Didn't flinch. But the daughter stepped closer, her voice cracking slightly. You're the one. The one who got him out. Dad has told me stories since I was 7 years old. Senior Chief Sullivan. You kept him alive when she couldn't finish. The breath caught in her chest like a hitch in a transmission. The nurses at the station turned. The orderly restocking the trauma cart froze mid-movement. 3 seconds of absolute silence, the kind that stretches like pulled taffy, and then the unit sliding doors opened with a mechanical hiss that sounded like an apology nobody had asked for. A man in dress blues walked through those doors with the particular bearing of someone accustomed to moving through rooms and having them reorganize themselves around his presence. His face was weathered by sun and seriousness, his eyes the color of a storm-churned Atlantic, and there was a name tape above his chest pocket, Holloway. A SEAL Team 3 call sign that half the younger nurses probably recognized, though Brooke suspected none of them truly understood what that meant, what it meant to be a man who'd seen doors get kicked in at 0200 hours and kept walking forward afterward. He'd been consulting with the hospital's trauma committee on protocol updates, a 2-day guest visit that nobody had thought would matter, and he stopped mid-stride when he saw Brooke Sullivan standing in scrubs next to a stretcher, looking like every field hospital medic he'd ever known, like someone who'd learned to save lives in dirt and darkness. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. And when he spoke, his voice came out like a tank idling in a garage, low and measured and absolutely certain. Senior Chief Sullivan earned the Navy Cross. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. 2 Purple Hearts. She kept my team leader alive for 40 minutes with her thumb in his femoral artery after an IED took out both medics in the convoy. 40 minutes. Talking him through it. Keeping him calm. Keeping him alive. I watched her do it. He paused. His eyes didn't leave Brooke's face. This woman isn't a nurse. She's a legend. And whatever happened here, whatever reason she's back in that uniform instead of wearing the full insignia she's earned, I want to know why someone isn't saluting her right now. The room shifted. Subtly. But Brooke felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm hits, like the whole architecture of Oak Creek Memorial's hierarchy had just experienced a structural failure it couldn't quite repair. The commander's daughter was crying now, understanding finally why her father had named his daughter after his corpsman, why he woke up sometimes at 0300 saying someone's name that wasn't hers. The interpreter's fingers found Brooke's wrist, pressing there like he needed confirmation she was real and not some morphine-induced hallucination of a ghost from Marjah who'd come back to finish her job. and 47 minutes later, in the administrator's office on the 4th floor where the carpet was thick enough to muffle footsteps and the windows overlooked the parking lot where Brooke had sat 3 days ago crying into her steering wheel, a woman in an FBI windbreaker sat across from Dr. Hargrove and opened a folder the size of a briefcase. Special Agent Marjah. Dark eyes that had seen institutional corruption in 7 different hospital systems. She placed a single photograph on the desk, a supply order form, dated March 12, in Brooke's meticulous handwriting, showing that the high-end CT equipment Dr. Hargrove had billed Medicare for had never actually been used. Phantom CT scans, Marjah said quietly. Billed to Medicare under patient names that don't exist in any of the admission records we cross-referenced with Senior Chief Sullivan's notes. 57 instances. Each scan priced at $3,847. That's $219,079 just in phantom imaging. Dr. Hargrove's face had begun to gray, the color draining away like someone had opened a drain valve somewhere beneath his collar. His hand sat on the desk in front of him, and they were starting to shake. Marjah continued, medical device kickbacks. Your company received $47,000 over 14 months from Advanced Surgical Solutions for device recommendations that Senior Chief Sullivan's documentation proves you didn't actually use. Ghost patients. Records of admissions for people who never walked through your hospital's doors, never occupied beds, never consumed medications, all documented in your billing system, all flagged in her supply reconciliation notes. She closed the folder. Softly. Like she was closing a coffin. We've been building this case for 8 months. Senior Chief Sullivan's documentation provided the final evidence we needed. Wire fraud. Healthcare fraud. Conspiracy. Witness intimidation. We have a recording of your call to the credentialing office demanding they re-verify her transcripts. That was pressure. That was retaliation. Federal charges, Dr. Hargrove. Multiple counts. Your attorney is waiting in the hallway. The office door opened an hour later, and Dr. Hargrove walked out into a corridor that seemed to have narrowed somehow. FBI agents in windbreakers were speaking quietly with the HR director, who looked like someone who'd finally been given permission to tell the truth. The board chair, the one who vacationed on Hargrove's boat, was calling his attorney. The CEO was reviewing 8 months of emails and pressure campaigns with an expression that suggested he'd been naive about which subordinates could be trusted. And there, at the administrative hallway's far end, stood the security guard who'd handed Brooke her termination box 5 days ago. He was holding another cardboard box. This one belonged to Dr. Hargrove. The security guard's eyes were hard as flint. I believe you know the way out, sir. 3 words. That's all it took. Hargrove's hands shook as he took the box, as he entered his office 12 feet away from the nursing station, his fingers fumbling with desk items like they belonged to someone else's life. The unit board still displayed Brooke's write-up in red marker. The charge nurse passed by it, paused, and erased it silently. No one spoke as Hargrove walked past the trauma bay one final time, past the nurses who'd watched him berate them, past the commander in bed 7 whose eyes were finally opening after 37 hours of sleep, past the interpreter who whispered something in Pashto that sounded like forgiveness or vengeance. Brooke couldn't quite tell which. The new segment on healthcare fraud 6 months later was filmed at a community college in a suburb nobody famous had ever mentioned. Dr. Hargrove, standing before a room of bored students in polyester chairs, teaching CPR compressions to people who mostly cared about getting their certification without failing. His medical license suspended. His reputation atomized. The camera cut away before he finished speaking. Meanwhile, at Oak Creek Memorial, sunlight streamed through the auditorium windows the same way it had on the day Brooke had first walked out carrying her termination box, except now the room was filled with staff in dress clothes and dress uniforms. The commander stood in his marine dress blues, finally awake, finally healed, his forearm visible where her name was tattooed in block letters across his skin. He gripped Brooke's hand like he was still in Marjah, still bleeding, still trusting her to keep him breathing. His daughter stood beside him with tears that wouldn't stop coming. A SEAL Team 3 leader presented Brooke with a plaque, the unit's highest civilian honor. The interpreter, now recovering and working as the hospital's trauma interpreter, saluted her with a precision that meant something in 3 languages. The VA had assigned her a therapist who understood that combat trauma didn't end when you left the combat zone. Her mother sat in the front row, finally understanding why those deployment years had been silent, finally understanding what her daughter had carried. The CEO offered her the nursing supervisor position. She accepted without hesitation. On her first day, she entered the break room and found it full of staff. Nobody left when she sat down. Someone had saved her a seat. The trembling in her hands had stopped somewhere between the VA appointment and the first night she'd slept without jerking awake at 0300. The commander's uniform hung in her closet now, pressed and ready, because he'd asked her to march with him at a ceremony honoring Marjah's 12-year anniversary of the operation that had cost everyone there something irreplaceable. She'd said yes. Her voice had come out steady. "I'd be honored, Commander." The news anchor's voiceover played that evening while Brooke watched from her apartment, coffee cooling in her hands. "Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark." The segment ended with a photograph of her in dress uniform, the commander beside her, both of them looking at something beyond the camera's frame, toward whatever came next, toward whatever you built when the breaking finally stopped. Subscribe for more stories of people who carried secrets that changed everything. Like this video if you believe the quietest people sometimes hold the most power. Comment below, what would you have done if you discovered your boss was defrauding Medicare? And follow us for stories that remind us why documentation matters, why heroes are often invisible, and why every single person in a hospital might be saving lives you'll never know about. Because the truth is simpler and harder than any villain deserves. Sometimes the people you overlook are the only ones standing between chaos and survival.